Hello. Last time we looked at how humanism manifested itself in Renaissance literature, architecture and art. In this lesson, I'll discuss the changing status of artists during the Renaissance, the nature of patronage, without which little or no art would have been produced, and end by considering three incomparable creative geniuses: Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Now, I said in the previous lecture that the image of the starving artist as a moody outsider who sacrifices everything for his art is an invention of the early 19th century. If artists starved during the Renaissance, it wasn't through choice, and a good number of them grew rich and achieved a status that few, if any, artists had ever achieved before. Today, many of them remain household names, even among the uneducated. But this change did not occur overnight. As late as the early 15th century, artists were still regarded as little more than craftsmen, anonymous artisans who worked to order and did their patrons' bidding. However, by the beginning of the 16th century, all this had changed. According to Francis Ames Lewis, a leading authority on Renaissance art, many painters and sculptors had by then achieved artistic autonomy and intellectual independence, and the idea of the artist as a creative genius with a distinct identity and individuality had gained wide acceptance. Indeed, some artists were becoming celebrities and even objects of veneration. Michelangelo, for example, was dubbed the divine Michelangelo by his admirers, suggesting he possessed godlike powers, while other artists became rich. In 1 year, Leonardo earned 2,000 ducats, well over $1 million in today's money. Even a rather minor artist like Giorgio Vasari was able to amass a considerable fortune. But perhaps the following anecdote says more about the elevated status of artists during the Renaissance than any flattering title or large income. While having his portrait painted by Titian, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V picked up a paintbrush that Titian had accidentally dropped on the floor and handed it to the artist. Titian, bowing low and noticeably embarrassed, responded by saying, "Sire, one of your servants does not deserve such an honor." To which Charles replied, "Titian deserves to be served by Caesar." This may not seem so remarkable today, but Charles was arguably the most powerful ruler in all of Europe and believed that, like other kings at the time, he'd been placed on his throne by God. Despite their raised social standing, artists depended on patrons. Increasingly, during the Renaissance, art came to symbolize power. Unsurprisingly, therefore, artists were patronized by the rich and powerful, many of whom wanted the art they paid for to reflect their own prestige and elevated status. This is why artists often included depictions of their wealthy patrons in their paintings, sometimes portraying them as great religious figures or characters from classical mythology. One very notable example is Botticelli's Adoration of the Magi, in which the three kings are based on the likenesses of three members of the Medici family who had commissioned the painting. Botticelli even includes a self-portrait, indulging another obsession of Renaissance painters: self-promotion. Now, during the Renaissance, Italy led the world in banking, and many of the techniques we associate with modern banking were pioneered in cities like Florence and Venice. Thus, it should surprise no one that many of the most generous patrons of art came from families who had grown rich through banking. Indeed, a work that is considered by some to be the founding masterpiece of Renaissance painting, Giotto's paintings on wet plaster known as frescoes, depicting the life of Christ and the life of the Virgin, done on the walls of the Arena Chapel in Padua, was commissioned by Enrico Scrovegni, a wealthy banker. As time progressed, successful banking families were able to convert economic power into political power. Now, most famous of all such families, of course, were the Medici of Florence. Now, to be sure, no account of the Renaissance is complete if it makes no mention of this influential Florentine family, dubbed the godfathers of the Renaissance. At the height of their power in the 15th century, they ruled Florence as if they owned it, which in many ways they did. Having made a fortune by ignoring the ecclesiastical prohibition against usury, that is, lending money at interest, they spent much of it on art, especially Cosimo Medici and his grandson Lorenzo, dubbed the Magnificent. They did so not only because they were cultivated men of exquisite taste, which of course they were, but because they desired art that would glorify them and reflect their power and prestige. Popes also patronized artists. In fact, it was due to the likes of Julius II and Leo X that Rome became the center of artistic production during the High Renaissance of the early 16th century. At a time when the Catholic Church was beginning the gargantuan task of rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica, artists flocked to the city, including Raphael and Michelangelo, who, together with the architect Donato Bramante, drew up the plans for what many consider the greatest church in Christendom. Although he did not live to see its completion, Michelangelo's magnificent dome atop the basilica has inspired architects ever since. It must be apparent to you by now that the Renaissance produced a plethora of artists that deserve the adjective great attached to their names, and many more who fell somewhat shy of greatness, but produced work of high quality and enduring beauty nonetheless. Having said this, however, there are three names that inevitably stand out from the rest. I refer, of course, to Leonardo da Vinci, who lived from 1452 to 1519, Michelangelo Buonarroti, who lived from 1475 to 1564, and Raffaello Santi, better known as Raphael, who lived from 1483 to 1520. However you look at it, these three creative titans seem to rise above even the greatest of their contemporaries in representing the Renaissance spirit in its most advanced formulation. While all three were polymaths, it is Leonardo who has become a byword for that Renaissance ideal known as a universal or Renaissance man. According to Vasari, Leonardo possessed such a power of intellect that whatever he turned his mind to, he made himself master of with ease, and was interested in all branches of knowledge. His famous notebooks reveal his passion for a wide variety of subjects, from anatomy and botany to physics and civil engineering, from optics and cartography to mathematics and military technology. Among other things, they contain detailed diagrams of such modern modes of transportation as helicopters, submarines, and bicycles. He was also the first to accurately depict an unborn baby in its correct position within its mother's womb. Another of his drawings, perhaps his most famous, the so-called Vitruvian Man, which is a study of the proportions of a man, links science and art in such a compelling way that it has become the iconic image of Renaissance humanism. His finished paintings, of which far too few have survived, invariably reflect his interest in science. For example, the Mona Lisa and the Lady with an Ermine are studies in the effects of light, changing forever how artists treated light in their paintings. While the Virgin of the Rocks reveals Leonardo's profound knowledge of geology. Besides the Mona Lisa, perhaps his most famous painting is The Last Supper, a mural that depicts the apostles at the very moment when Jesus informs them that one among them will betray him. As he grew older, Leonardo's fame spread far and wide. Towards the end of his life, he was invited by France's highly cultivated King Francis I to leave Italy and move to France, where he was given a great house near the royal palace in which to live. There, 3 years after leaving Italy, he died on May 2nd, 1519. On the day of his death, as recounted by Vasari, he confessed and was penitent, and was pleased to take devoutly the most holy sacrament. He told the king, who sat by his bedside, that he had offended God and mankind in not having worked at his art as he should have done. Thereupon he was seized by a paroxysm, the messenger of death, and expired in the arms of the king in the 75th year of his age. Like Leonardo, Michelangelo was also a polymath. In addition to his supreme achievements in sculpture, architecture, engineering, and painting, he also wrote some of the most beautiful sonnets in the Italian language. Indeed, had he never used a chisel or picked up a paintbrush, he would be remembered for his poetry. However, it is for his sculpture and painting that he is chiefly famous today. While some of his contemporaries rivaled him in painting, none did so in sculpture. Partly raised by a stonecutter and his wife and receiving a humanist education, he was apprenticed to a painter at age 13, but eventually studied sculpture at the studio of a well-known teacher, where he had his nose broken by a fellow apprentice in a violent altercation, incidentally. His gifts manifested themselves early, and he became something of a youthful prodigy. His accomplishments are too numerous to list here, but at age 24 he carved his moving Pietà, which depicts Christ's body in his mother's lap after the crucifixion. And 6 years later he completed his monumental statue of the biblical David, commissioned by the city of Florence to symbolize Florentine freedom. Carved in marble and 17 feet in height, Michelangelo's David is one of the most recognizable works of art ever produced. Vasari described it as a miracle, adding that the sculptor possessed the ability to restore to life one who was dead. In 1508, Pope Julius II persuaded Michelangelo to undertake the painting of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. The work was executed, according to Vasari, with great discomfort to himself, from his having to labor with his face upwards, which so impaired his sight that for a time, which was not less than several months, he was not able to read letters or look at drawings, save with his head backwards. Michelangelo died at age 88 in 1564, working to within a week of his death. His achievements are difficult to overstate, and he continues to present an iconic image of the artist as a heroic figure. It has been said that Raphael had neither the immense range of knowledge of Leonardo nor the power of Michelangelo. However, Raphael could paint. Gosh, could he ever paint? His best paintings seem so effortless that one can easily forget that he was one of the hardest working painters of his day, struggling to catch up with older, more established masters. Unlike Leonardo and Michelangelo, however, who were remote and difficult to get along with, Raphael was the type of man that everybody loved. His legendary sweetness of spirit and evenness of temper endeared him to all, winning him many friends and the all-important patronage of the rich and famous. Dubbed by his contemporaries the divine painter, his greatest work is characterized by a refined gentleness and graceful harmony that is coupled with phenomenal technique. His flawless and very moving Madonnas remain standards of perfection. One is struck by their sweet loveliness and sheer beauty. Arguably, his most familiar work is the fresco known as the School of Athens, which you see behind me, which has become one of the iconic paintings of the Renaissance. Depicting many of the greatest thinkers of the ancient world, It celebrates the links between the Renaissance and classical antiquity. By using the likenesses of Leonardo to represent Plato, Michelangelo to represent Heraclitus, and himself to represent the classical Greek painter Apelles, Raphael seems to be suggesting that the men of the Renaissance are the equal of the great figures of antiquity. No greater statement of Renaissance ideals could be imagined. Indeed, the School of Athens, which is considered Raphael's masterpiece, can be seen as the perfect embodiment of the classical spirit that lay at the heart of the Renaissance. When Raphael died on Good Friday in 1520 at the early age of 37, the entire papal court went into mourning. Pope Leo X, we are told, wept bitterly when he learned of Raphael's death. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.